Stage fright.
I'm hoping it's just a voice and not actually
Mine was.
Well, you see the photo as well.
So, when I had a bit of a think about it, tried to do a bit of looking around and to get a bit of an idea, as a rough guess, which really for me is based on no research whatsoever, but it seemed like a good idea at the time, 90% of all Christians believe, I think, the reality is I think 90% of all Christians believe that God is exclusively male. I don't think that that's an unfair assumption. When you look at the different church and faith communities, the different Christian faith communities, there's a distinct maleness to God in the way that they worship and in the way that they actually celebrate God's existence. Even though I think these days most Christian and Jewish communities kind of grudgingly admit that God created woman in His image as well, which is translated to a fair treatment of women only extremely recently, which is rather sad. It's safe to say that most Christians, at least the males, have no trouble with the philosophy women may not serve God at the altar because God is exclusively male. Jesus Christ is exclusively male, and all Jesus' disciples and apostles were male. That's right, isn't it?
No.
Clearly you're more educated than most. Because it's actually false. Really, really false. So if we look at these particular examples and look at and these are common things that people believe. Jesus did have plenty of female disciples and apostles. They aren't as well known though. Mary Magdalene was his favourite disciple. The apocryphal thank you. I didn't do that. Try and say apocryphal and gospel straight after each other. The apocryphal Gospel of Philip even tells us that she was his koionis, a word that means partner, close companion, or even consul. The Bible refers to such disciples as Joanna, Susanna, and Tabitha, and to such apostles as Mary Magdalene, who was herself commissioned by Jesus in the Gospel of John. Second, there is no denying that Jesus Christ was a human man, whatever else he might have been. But Trinitarians say that he was both fully human and fully divine. Therefore, his human masculinity needs to take a back seat to the divine nature of God. So, at that stage, we need to separate the genderness from Jesus because of the divineness which kind of supersedes all that. And what about God? Is God exclusively male? The answer is obvious, isn't it?
No.
Ask the Catholic Church. Sorry, Bishop Ron. God is a spirit. God has no body, no physical body. God is omnipresent, which means that there is no place, no time, and no concept from which God is absent. God is simultaneously on the other side of the universe, 30 billion light years away, and God is also inside every single atom of our body. God is inside the protons and the electrons, the quarks, the strings of which you are composed. God is inside everything. God fills the universe even more thoroughly than water can fill a goldfish bowl. Usually because you leave that with the top. Because God has no physical body, God can have no, and I'm about to say this in church, God cannot possibly have a penis or a uterus. No, hard to believe. You may refer to God as male. Most people do. I mean, we can't stop really. But to refer to God as female is really and in reality just as valid. What about the Bible, you may ask? Yeah, thank you. I hoped you would ask that. Doesn't the Bible refer to God as exclusively male? Doesn't that make it sacrilegious to refer to God as female? Well, actually, no, and no. And we've got some examples of that up here already. God is imaged in many, many forms in the Bible. A rock, not too sure where that fits on the spectrum. Enough. Wind, she-bears, even a little red hen. The Bible describes God as a seamstress. possessing a womb, as a woman in labour, and as a nursing mother, as a mother with her weaned child, as a comforting mother, as a mother bear, and as a midwife, amongst many, many other feminine images. To have a little bit of understanding about the genderness, the first 12 chapters of Genesis were written primarily by the Yahwist tradition, making use of some of the material that was produced by the Elwist. Both of them so called by their preferred name for God. El was the principal god of the Canaanite Palestinian communities. His consort was known as, I've really got to refer to this because it's so tongue-tied, as Elath or Eloah, and together they were called Elohim, or Elohim, the gods. This is before we started to actually describe God as one entity. Yah or Yahweh was actually originally a volcano god, believe it or not. Well, that was quite amusing. The god of thunder, lightning and earthquakes, who often manifested in fire. So no surprise, God appeared within burning bushes and large fiery clouds guiding the Israelites. It's generally thought to be a kind of a combination of a whole lot of Mediterranean gods and goddesses, no less. Beginning with the original Yahuwah, a mountain goddess, and including El, Yayash, Yah, Shaddai, Enlil, Seth, Anu, Marduk, Yahu, believe it or not.
Yahoo!
Yahu, what? And even Enkai, his consort, worshipped in the Fertile Crescent for centuries before Yah or Yahweh came along. These are the origins about the different communities who sought to give God a name. And in giving God a name, often didn't just refer to God as male. There's a combination of male god and female god, or a combination of two gods worshipping as one, or two gods being worshipped as one. So a huge variety of different traditions which then were combined to form the concept or the understanding of what we know as God today. Exodus, which we've just heard, is usually translated, I am that I am, although it could equally well be translated, I become what I become, or I will be what I will be. It's quite hard to translate from Hebrew to English because the concepts and some of the language really doesn't cross over that well. When looking at the scriptures, there are a range of variations and versions which can give a lot of different understandings and interpretations. There are a few inclusive translations of the Bible which are a great resource, as these Bibles strive to provide a translation that is faithful to the original Hebrew and sensitive to the fact that just because men considered women property 3,000 years ago doesn't mean that God considered women to be men's property. When you're reading your own translation, be aware that when you see the word Lord, and I was kind of smiling to myself as we were singing today, oh Lord, ha-ha, you're actually seeing the Hebrew word Adonai, a euphemism based on the perfectly valid point that God has no name. When you see the word Lord, you're seeing an English euphemism for Yahweh, which is probably a combination of the different gods and goddesses. When you see the phrase Lord God, you're seeing a translation of Yahweh Elohim, literally Yahweh of the gods. And remember, Yahweh and Elohim were words that referred to both gods and goddesses. Doesn't it get confusing? Mm-hmm. It's quite tricky to understand. When we look at history, history gives us so much more variety than what we can cope with. The modern understanding is God has always been there as a single God, when in fact, the God we know has come about by the understanding and the combination of the different gods people worshipped, because effectively, the different gods people worshipped were the same God, but just in different definitions and different forms. We can take for granted that most of the men who inscribed their words onto parchment early in the first millennium considered women inferior, And that was the reality thousands and thousands of years ago. But one of the things that I'm aware of is that Hebrew has no concept for it. And most words in Hebrew default to the masculine gender because that was what was done in the time. When all is said and done, the fact remains that the Bible consistently refers to God using words that encompass both the male and the female, using he because Hebrew has no it, or neutral. When the scriptures were being written and also translated, it was generally by men, priests often, who are usually those people who could read and write, and those people who had power and control. Over time, different understanding of language and culture have also affected the translations of these scriptures. It's clear that the power and the status of males would be supported and reinforced by a male god. Otherwise, those with power may lose that power. So evidence of God as female, or the feminine nature of God, gradually disappeared from the scriptures, religious traditions, and also worship. After all, how could the powerful men over the millennia reinforce their status and power with a female God? There are also some men that continue to protest that God cannot possibly have any feminine qualities. I think we disagree. The unspoken presumption, and I think that there are cultures around that still have this presumption, that females are inferior, and many men believe this for thousands of years. I'd respond to these men that modern science, I know, tie a bit of science in there, it confuses and baffles people, but modern science has proven that in the first 7 weeks of the womb, all babies are actually sexually undifferentiated. Means that they have no gender. Only a DNA test after that time can determine which gender the baby may turn out to be. Can a man validly scorn a gender that he himself was, in the sense that he had no penis and no testicles, and no testosterone in the first 7 weeks? How could you do that? We were all the same at one point. And more than that, if we're all de facto female for the first 7 weeks of life, with female being the default gender, doesn't that actually make women created more in the image of God than men? Yeah. Gosh! Oh. How the Pope would love me now! Sorry, Pope Emeritus. To say that God is male, for me, is a limitation of faith. To limit God to maleness excludes all the wonderful femaleness that exists in God. Indeed, to even limit God to gender doesn't even acknowledge, or begin to acknowledge, the unlimited and the undefinable nature of God's immenseness. In fact, if we are forced to define God, I think that God would exist in the transgenderness of humanity, rather than male and female. Because transgenderness is both male and female, one element no less important than the other. Moving from one gender identity to the other and blending both at times is a much better way, I think, to acknowledge and to recognise who God really is. Yet at the end of the day, one key fact remains: God is. That's just it. God just is. To try and place God into our defined boxes of understanding will only reduce the enormity of Godness. God is male. God is female. God is both, and at the same time, God is neither. God just is.